Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. I think we'll get started as participants are still entering, but we've got a good number of people present now. So good afternoon, everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Emma Bunce and I'm the President of the Royal Astronomical Society. And I'd just really like to welcome all of you to this very special workshop today on the important topic of anti-racism in astronomy and geophysics. And I'm going to hand over to Aine O'Brien and Helen Jermak in just a moment, who will give a proper introduction to our speakers. But I would actually just like to extend my thanks to the speakers in advance for facilitating this session this afternoon. So we are all accountable for purposefully and intentionally tackling racism, diversity, equity and inclusion in our communities of astronomy and geophysics and in our places of work. And progress is made when we are well informed and self-reflective about our environment and our work culture. Our recent bullying and harassment survey, which you may have seen, has highlighted the disparities in our community's experience, and Aine will speak to this in a moment, and has revealed some shocking results. These issues are very important to the RAS, and hence this workshop has been organised for you today to attend. So my plan for today's session is to listen and to learn and to take note of how I can alter my actions and help influence change in my work environment and to alleviate the challenges faced and to tackle bias and discrimination. So we're delighted to see many of you here today. Thanks for coming along. And I hope that you find the session useful and informative. So at this point, I will stop talking and hand over to our hosts, Aine and Helen. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Emma, and welcome everybody. My name's Aine. I'm the Acting Diversity Officer for the Royal Astronomical Society. You might have met my colleague Sheila, who I am the maternity cover for. So hopefully in a second you'll be able to see my screen properly. Yeah. So today is just first of all a bit of housekeeping. Today is being recorded, and those of you here who've registered, you will be sent a link to the recording, but it won't be the whole event that's recorded. We will not be recording the discussions, questions, things like that. And there are some parts of our talks today that our speakers don't want recorded. And may I also ask, please do not screenshot any of our talks today, because there are parts they don't want sharing. So we will send the recording and all the parts you'll have access to there. But please take notes, get involved, make use of the Q&A and the fact that we've got anonymous question asking as well, if you'd like to get involved and feel you want to use that function as well. So what's today about? Well, it's a fellows only event on the fundamentals of anti-racism in astronomy and geophysics, and it's part of a greater focus on equality, diversity and inclusion at the RAS, like Emma said. It really does matter, and if you're passionate about this and you're not just here as a one-off learning thing and you actually want to get involved in driving this with the RAS, there's a few spaces on our diversity committee, CDAG, so keep an eye on your inboxes if you want to get involved, as we'll be advertising for people to apply to join that committee and running future workshops like this. As Emma said, the key motivation for today is the evidence that we have that racism exists in our field and that we all have a part to play in stopping it. I'm no expert in this, but our speakers are, and I'm so grateful to them for the workshops they're running for us today. But I will give you a tiny snapshot of this recent data we've got from the bullying and harassment report, which just shows you one part of why we need events like this. So what we showed from surveying over 660 astronomers and geophysicists is that astronomy and geophysics has a bullying problem. If you're disabled, you're 40% more likely to be bullied. If you're younger, you're much more likely to be bullied. If you're LGBTQ+, you're 50% more likely to be bullied. If you're trans, you're a woman, or you're non-binary, you're 50% more likely to be bullied. And our by astronomers and geophysicists, we found that we're bullied at least once a week. And centering on what we're focusing on today, we found that our BAME astronomers and geophysicists are 40% more likely to be bullied than their white counterparts. We have clear evidence that there is a problem in our sector. What does that look like in more detail? Here's just one of the graphs. If you're, we're astronomers, we like data. So we asked if our participants in the survey had been bullied in the last 12 months and how often. And we had to sadly group the ethnicity responses more than we'd like, just to preserve anonymity. But you can see here that our Black, mixed and other heritage respondents and our Asian respondents, almost 60% of them were bullied in the last 12 months, compared to only 40% of our white astronomers. Even more shocking still is that our Black, mixed and other heritage astronomers and geophysicists, were nearly 20% of them were bullied at least once a week. So it's a really clear difference. When you compare that with the white people who responded, it's only about 55%. So massive, massive difference there. Clearly a big problem. And not only did we find that you're more likely to experience bullying and harassment if you're a person of color, we also found that you're much more likely to have witnessed it as well. So one of our questions was, have you witnessed bullying and harassment in the last 2 years? We found that a little under 60% of white people had witnessed it, but more than 70% of our people of color who responded had witnessed it. So, and we know that witnessing bullying and harassment has a big impact, as well as suffering it yourself. So clear problem there as well. So what does today look like? We've got Dr. Jerita Holbrook at 1 p.m, Addie Barnett at 2 p.m, and Divya Persaud at 3 p.m. Hopefully it's going to be a really cool mix of stuff today. I appreciate it is an intense topic. Maybe you're not going to be able to join for the whole thing, but hopefully the fact that it's recorded will mean you can access it, bits you might have missed, or maybe you just don't have the capacity to take it all in at one go. But I really would encourage you to get involved, use the Q&A. In terms of the bullying and harassment stuff I mentioned, if you want to find out more, you can get in touch with me or check out our news release that came out a couple of weeks ago on the RAS website. And there's a full report coming out probably in September with much more data there. And if you're interested, if you've got an EDI group in your university and you want to know more about that data, I'd be happy to send that over to you, or speak at a meeting or anything like that. Okay, so without further ado, I will stop my screen share and I will give you our invite, or sorry, I'll introduce our first speaker. So Dr. Jerita Holbrook. Dr. Jerita Holbrook is a Marie Curie Fellow in Science, Technology and Innovation Studies at the University of Edinburgh. Their project, ASTROMOVES, investigates how astrophysicists navigate their careers while circulating through Europe and the UK. Holbrook holds degrees in physics, astronomy and astrophysics, and shifted to building an expertise in indigenous astronomy focused on Africans after their PhD on star formation from UC Santa Cruz. Dr. Holbrook is going to open today's event with their talk, Where is Race, Racism and Discrimination in Astrophysics and Astronomy? I realise we're a few minutes early. Jerita, do you want to start now, or do we want to have 5 minutes if people want to go get a cup of tea before we start? I'll leave it up to you what you'd like to do, Jerita.
It's okay for people to wait 5 minutes.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So we'll start in 5. Go grab yourselves a cup of tea. And yeah, like I say, please, hopefully it'll be an awesome workshop this afternoon. And we're just really excited for everyone to get involved and just, yeah. See you in a few minutes. Grab yourself a cup of.
Right, welcome everyone. I'm Jerita Holbrook. I am coming to you from a very rainy day in Edinburgh, which is normal for summer. And the title of my talk is here, Where is Race, Racism and Discrimination in Astronomy and Astrophysics? I wanted to start with my very biased survey. So I have been thinking about this for about a year, how surveys have built-in bias. And then I saw a presentation by Jocelyn Bell Barnett, who said basically the same thing that I'm saying, that even surveys have built-in biases. So this is my bias service. Her point, Jocelyn's point, was that when you go to sex, it says male first and then female, which she points out is not even alphabetical. So here would be my dream survey. And I would have you do it, but really I don't care about the results because I know there's like there's two Black people who would possibly be on this call today. And so there's no point in doing the survey. Number two, of course, is now difference between sex and gender. Sex is male, female. Gender is more about sexual identity combined with sex. So my ASTROMOVES project has a lot to do with gender identity, and I have a lot of gender categories in which I'm collecting about the astrophysicists that I'm studying. So here's just a fun gender survey: bisexual or non-bisexual. Those are your only options. How does that feel? I forgot. Can you guys hear that?
Yes, we can, Jermak.
Yes, we
Hear it.
I was raised an astronomer, there's no other way to put it, but I was much more interested in studying people. So I became what's called a cultural astronomer.
One of my favorite phrases is this: if you think you can do something, you're probably right. If you think you can't do something, you're definitely right.
To realize what a thrill it can be to get an A in a class if you haven't done that before. You know, boy, it is just so cool when you get an A and they have to look at this class. What did you do wrong? You must be doing something funny,
There you have it. Accusation of cheating. African American men tend to be accused of cheating at a disproportionate rate in astrophysics programs. Here's a quote from an African American male. That was Alphonse Sterling. That clip is the beginning of my film Black Suns: An Astrophysics Adventure. Okay, so African American male. That first year of graduate school, I didn't get A's. I got the worst grades of my life, right? I got C's and B's, okay? And you know, mostly B's, right? And so the thing to me was that, okay, I did not, you know, I bettered myself through hard work, but I got no credit for doing that. Obviously something must, and the implication was that I was violating the honor code. Another African-American male. And I also do try to work on my own, so no one can say I was cheating or copying off of them. So I always did homeworks by myself for the most part. This one is a complicated quote, so I'll set up the context. It's a study group that was set up outside of class to help students in this very difficult high-level postgraduate class. And it was open to all the students. But after a while, the white students stopped coming. So only the Black and brown students continued to come. When the exams came, the Black and brown students did very well, and the white students didn't pass. And so they went to the head of the program and complained about possible cheating. And the head of the program said, get out of my office, because they're the ones who made the decision to not attend the tutorials that were set up, even though they were open for everyone. Discrimination, perceived inferiority, white entitlement, and myth busting. So I do read my slides because I know that some people are vision impaired. So it's a bad habit, but you know, on Zoom, that's just what you have to do. So African-American males accused of cheating when they improve their grades, which is evidence of discrimination and perceived inferiority. White peers, white professors work with a fixed mindset. Their Black students are perceived as static. They cannot grow and they cannot learn, which is, of course, against the idea that they were let into a PhD program in astrophysics because they were smart enough to get in, right? White students' sense of entitlement. They absolutely felt they had the right to complain about the Black students doing better than they did, even when they themselves refused to attend the tutorials that were open to everyone. So we're coming up against the myth of white intellectual superiority, okay, such that they felt they should be able to pass the class without attending the tutorials. And if they did not pass the class, was it an indication that the system was broken? That is like a huge sense of entitlement. So these quotes come from my many years of social science research on astrophysicists. I began studying astrophysicists in 2009. I did not change from being an astrophysicist to being a social scientist to study astrophysicists. I did it to study indigenous astronomy. So I'm the world's expert on African indigenous astronomy. However, people asked me, I was kind of dragged into studying astrophysicists. Everyone said, you know, you're an astrophysicist, you know what you're doing, you're a diverse astrophysicist. You really, now you're a social scientist. You really should turn your lens to astrophysicists. And I was like, no, 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 no. And then finally I said yes. Someone who's very dear to my heart brought a project to me that I just could not say no to. And this is the first one listed in 2009. The study of diversity among data-driven astrophysics teams. So think Sloan Digital Sky Survey, what was then LSST. In 2009, I also filmed Hubble's Diverse Universe, which I'll show you a clip from later. In 2010, I did a study of education of diverse astrophysicists, where that quote about the class and the tutorials came from. Then in 2012, I think it was after I was head of the Historical Astronomy Division of the American Astronomical Society, and I started the AAS Oral History Project, which still runs today. 2012, I also started filming Black Suns and Astrophysics Adventure, which you saw the opening to, and which captures being accused of cheating because you get an A in a class. Not the whole film, just that little clip. And then in 2018, I started the South African Oral History Project on astronomy and astrophysics in South Africa. And of course, today I'm studying the career moves of astrophysicists with an intersectional lens. So race, racism, and discrimination. And I have to also warn people that you may be triggered by some of the things that I'm saying. So please, if you need to step away from this presentation, I understand. I've been studying this for a long time, and it's still, some of the things that I say, when I get off, I will cry. I will cry. So it's still very, very moving. So here's some questions. Do astrophysicists attach intelligence to skin color? Do astrophysicists attach intelligence to hairstyle? And I purposely made my hair big today. Do astrophysicists have an internal ranking system where people are ranked by sex, gender, race, and nationality, with white male USA, UK native English speakers at the top? Which astrophysicists are considered to be geniuses and which are merely hardworking? Do astrophysicists see a diverse astrophysics as one of less value because of these internal beliefs? Let's start by talking about resistance to change. We like to be the hero of our own story. We do not want to be the bad person. We do not want it to be our fault, so we shift blame. We are lazy. We want to change, but don't want to actually do anything to ensure change. Or we want to change only one thing. We want one solution to a very complex issue. We choose to put our time into other things, writing, data collection, rather than those actions that could bring about cultural change, such as recruiting, teaching, and learning. Typical arguments about the lack of diversity in astronomy. Remember, I've done this talk like a million times. So deselection. Candidates choose to not engage or apply. Deficiency. Candidates are not able. Leaky pipeline. Diverse candidates leak out of astronomy at each new rank. Unconscious bias. Astronomers enact biases against diverse candidates, limiting their achievements. Stereotype threat. Candidates experience stereotype threat, leading to poor performance. And K-12 education. Candidates are poorly prepared because of their K-12 education, leading to poor performance. So I don't think I spent a lot of time defining these. So I want to mention about stereotype threat. I think everybody knows all the other ones, but stereotype threat is that you can actually, it's the same as like triggering someone, that if you call attention to a negative stereotype about the group that they're a part of before they do a test, then you send their head spinning. So they are worried about the fact that they have to now carry the weight of their whole community on their shoulders as they're taking this test. And their performance has far more weight and far more significance because they're thinking about this and think of it that way. So instead of using their brain cells on the content of the test, brain cells are being wasted with this head spin, this anxiety about, okay, so if I do poorly on this test, they're never going to let another Black student into this program. That kind of thinking. So that's stereotype threat. So basically you can say, they found in experiments that with women and mathematics tests, if they called attention to the fact that they were women, they performed worse. If they called attention to the fact that they were women and then said there's something called stereotype threat and explained what it was, then the women performed normally. So let's look at deficiency. Who is at fault? Here are some of the deficiency arguments. Diverse people do not have the background or training to be astronomers. Diverse people do not understand what it takes to become an astronomer. I'm using astronomer, astrophysics interchangeably. Diverse people would not be able to do the traveling necessary to become an astronomer. Thus, they are deficient, and it is their own fault. Deselection. Who is to blame? Diverse people are not interested in astronomy. Diverse people are not interested in working hard, as is required in astronomy. Diverse people are more interested in getting or need to get good paying jobs right out of university. Thus, diverse people choose not to engage. It's their own fault. Other blame shifting. The leaky pipeline. It implies that the pipeline and leaking are not under the control of the astronomers and are not a result of the culture astronomers have created. Unconscious bias. Even though their actions adversely impact the lives of diverse candidates, the astronomers are absolved of blame because it's unconscious. Stereotype threat. Even though the astronomers trigger stereotype threat with their words and behaviors, the diverse candidates perform poorly as a result. Thus, it is their own fault. K-12 education, shifting the blame to a realm out of astronomers' control rather than addressing changes that can be made under their control. And one more blame shifting move, blaming rules, regulations, policies at the departmental, college, or university level. These rules were made by people and they can be changed by people. So let's stop blame shifting. Okay, and let's get busy. So suggested, Astronomy daily hours for classes, colloquial, seminar, meetings, departmental events, meals should be between 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. to prevent conflict with parents needing to pick up and drop off their children. So all of these suggestions were pre-COVID, so keep that in mind. So for example, George Mason University in Virginia, their grad classes are in the evenings. So this is easy for family scheduling, and the graduate students can have a job, an external job. And that's the way their department was designed. For their students work during the day, and then they come to the department and do their PhDs in the evenings. Childcare grants for conferences. I think everyone knows about that. It's happening pretty regularly. Of course, there's not enough money to provide childcare for everyone, but maybe we'll get there one day. And then there's workshops that can be organized for faculty members to take, cross-cultural competency, active listening, anti-bias training, cohort building training. And I was one of the co-authors on the 2021 document, IAU Springboard to Action, which is all about how to make astrophysics, or suggestions of how to make astrophysics more inclusive and therefore leading to more diversity. So in thinking through decolonizing astronomy, think about the way astronomy and astrophysics is set up today. Who is best served by the current method of education? So focusing on the time demanded alone, who's best served? The candidates who do not have to work outside of being a student, candidates who do not have many family or community obligations, candidates that get to the department easily and quickly as needed, pointing to different abilities. And now with COVID-19, candidates that have access to and can afford stable internet connectivity. So as you're thinking about decolonizing astronomy and making it more welcoming and inclusive, think about the barriers these present, and then how to remove those barriers. Perceived inferiority. A Black South African astrophysicist states, it shows you the kind of damage that apartheid has done. It has created two worlds which do not communicate to each other. And the privileged of those two worlds does not care at all about the underprivileged one. They don't understand. They don't understand why the Black students don't perform. They think that maybe it confirms their belief that maybe the other people are not intelligent. They don't have it in their genes to make it. All right, this is a long quote, so I'll paraphrase it. Let me read it so I remember what it is. Okay, so a graduate student who was a Black male at a very prestigious university did not pass the qualifying exam to the advanced candidacy exam the first time, but passed it very well the second time. But after he passed it, he was still asked to leave the program. And he went to the person who was head of all of this and said, you told me that, if I did well, then I could stay. So why are you asking me to leave? And the advisor said, well, we asked ourselves, if a guy like this, who had not graduated from a prestigious university, is able to pass our classes, then what does that say about our classes? So now we put in class exams, and all the incoming students can thank you for it. So it's not uncommon. That's not the first time I've heard that story. But it's nice to have quotes about it. So when a Black or diverse student passes the qualifying exam, the department treats them as if they didn't pass, changes the exam to make it harder. And 3, they will not, nobody in the faculty will work with that student if they've already labeled that student as being a bad student, right? Even though they've improved and passed what was set out in front of them. And so the student often has to go outside of the department. So affiliating or working with someone at an observatory or a national lab in order to get their PhD. And I put here for Black students, but actually I knew a Hispanic female who had the same thing happen to her, that when she passed, everyone in the department acted like she didn't pass and actually turned her success into a failure, which kind of marked her whole progress through to get her PhD. And unsurprisingly, she left the field after she got her PhD. Next film clip.
I meet Art Walker, and Art Walker is, clearly the most successful Black astronomer in history. Okay, Art was the go-to guy for people that were having a difficult time. Even if they were professors. One of our professors was, I remember, Peter Michelson. He's the grandson of Michelson, of the famous Michelson-Morley experiment. I remember when he was going through the difficulties of the 90s, he would always come in to talk to Art about it. So Art guided many of us. And so if you look, Art now has so many students, but they're minorities, underrepresented women. His first graduate student was Sally Ride, right? He was always working on diversity issues, but at the same time was the first-rate scientist. When people see all these pretty pictures of the sun you see now with all that, the plasma loops and everything, Art was the first one to do that, right? Art got the first spectra of the sun from a satellite in space. He was just an amazing, amazing human being. Even though he had achieved so much, I still saw him getting challenged on by being not so smart by people and things, it was ridiculous. But I saw the way that he handled the hostility. I saw the elegance and the firmness with which he handled it. The first thing he would always do is he would stop and gather himself. And then he'd speak very slowly and clearly and precisely. And he would say what he had to say, but there was nothing crass about it, ever, right? Ever. He was so elegant. And he was by stature, he was short. I don't know, 5'4", 5'6", somewhere in there, right? But, to be in his presence, you felt like he was 7'6", 7'6", right? And so it was about precision, clarity, right? And, choosing your words. It doesn't help you to go off in anger, right? To tell someone off, right? That doesn't get you anywhere. I meet Art Walker.
Okay, discrimination. Okay, my problem with this scenario is that I'm South African, so it's easy to see things in black and white. And I make a conscious effort not to do that because I'll kill myself. Second quote, no, I'm done with classes, thank God. I'm working on my thesis now with Dr. Blank. Luckily, he's not one of the white guys that discriminates against Black people. Okay, all right. But I want to describe a different scenario where white students are, say, treated better. You're not treated bad, but they're treated better than you. You don't have anything to really complain about because they're not treating you bad, but you can see your fellow students are being treated way better than you are. I don't know. I think with white South Africans, it's really funny in a way because, like you say, there's years and years of white supremacy, and sometimes it seems to be like they're not even aware of what they're doing. All right, this is a long one. This is from an African-American astrophysics student when he was presenting at science fair. He noticed that the students around him who were not Black were being treated a lot better, and their projects were being considered at greater length than his was. And I'll start reading it towards the bottom. I didn't see myself as a Black person competing. Then, as I grew into college and I started to attend AAS meetings, it became clear that in this field in particular, you are a Black person and you are conscious of that. It's evolving over time. So discussion. Are shared experiences indicative of a global astrophysics culture that is unsupportive of people of African descent? If you think that this is happening only in South Africa and America, you're wrong. So, and I want to make it clear that I've talked to a lot of Black astrophysicists in Europe. Believe me, it happens here too, and in the United Kingdom. So discrimination quotes that I've shown you speak of the impact of being Black, not necessarily of being women, foreign, or class. So supportive of this idea of an anti-Black culture within astrophysics. And there's perceived inferiority, the common accusation of cheating when there is an improvement in grades, especially with Black men. The implication that if a Black person can do well, the classes are too easy. And both are responses to the challenge to the myth of white intellectual superiority. So I have some concluding remarks. We're towards the end. You can take a breath. Science cultures can be changed. We need to stop comparing the diversity of astrophysics and astronomy with the worst disciplines. Instead, let's become the best. So in particular, we're always saying, we're better than physicists. It's like, why are we always comparing ourselves to the worst? We need to become the best, and we can. We're a small community. We can do this. So as you're working towards changing the culture, suppress the need to confess. Please, I am not a priest or priestess. Don't confess to me. And suppress the need to prove you aren't part of the problem. Even I'm part of the problem. I know it. I'm a jerk. Get prepared to be the bad person and the person none of your colleagues wants to talk to. Heaven forbid I should walk into your office. You know you're going to hear it. We are ready. Are we ready to dive deeply into the ways astronomy and astrophysics needs to change in order to become more inclusive? So I open the floor to discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. That was really interesting. I particularly appreciated raising the concept of stereotype threat. I hadn't come across that before. And I think that ties into as well some of the questions that we've had about the assumption that you can't possibly be doing well based on, you know, a stereotype about how you come across. I will just introduce our speaker who joined us a couple of minutes ago, and then we'll move on to the next talk. Addie, do you want to just check that you can share your screen and that it comes up okay? Fabulous. Okay. So our next speaker is Addie, who is a senior consultant at Inclusive Employers, working with a range of organisations on complex projects, including anti-racism programmes, leadership development, and strategic planning for inclusion and diversity. Addie started his working life in further education sector as a teacher and teacher trainer, specialising in managing challenging behaviour. He joined Inclusive Employers after 5 years in the homelessness sector, managing frontline services and leading on LGBTQIA+ inclusion. Addie's session, Anti-Racism 101, focuses on the fundamentals of anti-racism in the workplace. Addie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Afternoon. I only caught the end of Jerita's talk, but I just wanted to pick up before I start on a point there about on the final slide that was shown. It's worth remembering in the context of both my talk today and just generally this afternoon that cultures and processes and systems don't exist in and of themselves. They're made by people and they're sustained by people. So that means that if you change the people, you can change the system. And I think that in this space and in a lot of inclusion and diversity spaces, actually, it can feel overwhelming, the size of things sometimes, but we can and do change things. It is possible. So that's just worth remembering, I suppose, as a, you know, just sort of keep your optimism, keep focused on that as we go through. So I've started with this quote because I think it's a good way for us to just sort of think about what our priorities are going to be in this talk this afternoon, in this session. And then I'll sort of talk about how it's going to work. So this is from Ibrahim X. Kendi, who's written lots of work around this. His book, How to Be Anti-Racist, is a pretty good kind of primer for the sort of key topics, things to think about. If a person does nothing in the face of racial inequities that are pervasive, if they don't challenge them, what are they doing? So that's going to be kind of our theme, our sort of core for my session this afternoon. It's going to centre around this idea that inaction isn't neutral, and that inaction is an action in and of itself. So we'll sort of return to that, think about that a little bit later on. In terms of what we're going to look at in this talk over the next sort of 50 minutes or so, we're going to think about what anti-racism actually is, and have a go at sort of shaping it and getting our heads around it. We're going to think about how racism affects the astronomy and geophysics community. We're going to talk about how discomfort with talking about race affects everybody, and how we need to really honestly look at and face that discomfort if we're going to sort of go anywhere. And then think about what moving forward might be, what kind of actions might be. So again, kind of circling back to that point, if we can change people, then we can change systems. So we need to think about what we're going to do. Now, I very specifically chose this image for this slide. So this is from Chicago Pride last year before, I think. To be fair, my concept of time is pretty broken post-pandemic. I've got a feeling it might have been 2019 rather than 2020. And the reason why I've used this image is that it reminds us, when we're thinking about anti-racism, in fact, when we're thinking about any area of diversity and inclusion, is about intersectionality. So what that means is that people's identities and experiences don't fit neatly into little boxes. You know, we aren't just our race, we aren't just our sexuality, we aren't just our disability, whatever it is. All of those things interact and intersect with one another in complex ways. So it's a reminder to always try and think expansively when we're considering these kind of topics, and to try and consider everyone who falls under that umbrella and all the different sort of experiences and the way the world sees them and treats them, and the experiences that they have sort of mixed into that. All right, so throughout this session, there's going to be a couple of interactive elements using Slido. Now, all you need to do, I'm sure you've used Slido before, is just open a web browser. So whenever these slides come up, that's your cue. You can scan the QR code off the screen, or you can go to slido.com and put in that code, which is 641880. And there'll be a question. The question is, what do you think the difference is between being not racist and being anti-racist? So you just type your response in. I'll give you a minute or so to do that, and then we will look at the responses once they come through. So we'll give you a minute or so to open a web browser. It can be on your phone, it can be on your laptop, wherever you like, really. Either go to slido.com and put in that code and just do as it tells you, basically. It's nice and easy to use, or you can scan the QR code and follow the instructions from there. So I'll give you a minute or so to sort of gather your thoughts and put in your responses. So we're thinking about the difference between being not racist and being anti-racist. Oh. So let me just change my screen so that we can see what Slido is telling us. Okay. So differences between not racist and being anti-racist. If you want to start putting your responses in.
Addy, I think it's just reset itself. There were like 20 answers.
Oh no.
And it's all just reset.
Oh, Slido, why have you done this to me?
I think that in as questions, there's like a Q&A.
Oh.
Oh yes, go into the Q&A section rather than polls, yeah.
Oh, hang on, we're getting some through.
Yeah, they come up as Q&A for us.
Oh, that's interesting. But
yeah, I guess if people can put their answers in the poll.
There we go, they're coming through. Apologies for that. Slido decided to have some fun with PowerPoint and not behave itself. Lovely, thank you everyone. So we've got the responses coming through. Yeah, so there's some themes here in that not racist has a sense of sort of passivity to it, whereas anti-racist, there's more action. Again, sort of consciously challenging systems of oppression, whereas that sort of passive response is the sort of falls under the not racist. Trying to change things for the better rather than not making them worse. I like that. That's a good way to describe it. So anti-racist is an active commitment to opposing racism when you see it, as opposed to only taking responsibility for stopping yourself from being racist. That's good. Yep, action. Actively challenging rather than just being quiet and unoffending. Yeah, that's another good way to describe it. Excellent. Actively building an inclusive environment. Taking a look at the structural elements which contribute to racism and working to dismantle them. So anti-racism is directly challenging and changing your own and others' behaviour. So I'll give us one more minute. Doing the work yourself instead of waiting for those who are oppressed to kindly educate you. Some fantastic answers in here. It's a good point on the bottom of this page. It's not possible to not be racist in a racist society. The point you're making there is that you're either anti-racist or you're racist. You're kind of holding up the system, you're supporting the system. Excellent. Okay. Thanks, everyone. So, not racist, as a lot of you were saying, there's a really clear theme of this coming through in your responses. It's that passivity. It's that sense of kind of not doing anything particularly about it. It's a sort of passive state to be in. Doesn't challenge others, sees racism as an individual moral failure rather than something that's institutional and structural. So I'll talk about that in a minute. And you often get sort of interesting comments and phrases like, I don't see colour, or I'm not racist, my best friend is XYZ, you know, that kind of thing. The seeing racism as an individual moral failure is very common, actually. And a lot of that is in the way that socially we think and talk about racism a lot of the time. Now, that's a discussion that has matured a lot in the last 12 months or so as a result of the sort of resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement after George Floyd's murder. But I think we've still got a bit of a way to go in terms of thinking about this in a more broadly across society in a more complex way. But it's the idea that an individual will do a racist thing and therefore they are a racist and will be labelled as such forever, rather than seeing it as this is an environment, these are institutions and structures and stereotypes and value judgments and hierarchies that we're all in, that we're sort of submerged in, that's like the water that we're swimming around in. And therefore, of course, it affects all of us because it's the environment that we're in. So increasingly, as we try and move towards anti-racism, we're thinking about these things in different ways. So if you're being anti-racist, it's that activeness, and this came out in a lot of your responses. So you're actively developing your own knowledge and self-awareness. Now, the sort of first step with really any aspect of inclusion, to be honest, if you want to be genuinely effective, is looking inwards first and committing to work on yourself while you take action and support other people and challenge other people. You've got to start here. You've got to start kind of at home. And developing your own knowledge and self-awareness is a really big, important part of that. Someone who's anti-racist acknowledges that they will have racist biases, stereotypes, assumptions in them. We all have them. They are in there. We grow up surrounded by all of this stuff. Even if you just look at some of the sort of discussions and thoughts that have been happening in the last year around representation of Black people on TV or in films, there's still so far to go. And if you think everyone, even just thinking about in the UK, the hundreds and hundreds of hours of media we've consumed, and by that I mean obviously social media, but things like books and films, TV shows, adverts, you know, we are bombarded with this imagery and these messages all the time. They are in there. People who are anti-racist can see or learn to see, start to see the interpersonal, institutional and structural way that racism operates. So it becomes less about an individual's moral failing and someone being kind of the odd one out for saying or doing a racist thing, and more of an understanding of that bigger picture, that we are in these racist structures, institutions, these ways of seeing the world, of being in the world, that we need to unpick and unlearn and sort of take people with us on that sort of journey. So like I was saying at the beginning, the kind of thread through today is about inaction isn't action. It's so doing nothing isn't neutral, doing nothing isn't really doing nothing. And silence particularly is not neutral. And white silence is a whole thing that we will look at in a bit when we think about sort of white fragility and some of the ways that our discomfort, those of us who are white, in talking about race comes through. So like I said, the first step to being anti-racist is that kind of self-work stuff. And one of those key bits of understanding is getting comfortable with being uncomfortable when talking about race and racism. Partly, if we don't talk about something, we can't do anything about it. You know, if you don't talk about a topic, if you don't think about a topic, you can't solve it. So it has to come out, it has to become a topic of conversation. I think in my experience, working with lots of different organizations in the last year in my job, we're getting there. It's become more of a topic of conversation. I think the risk at the moment is that where we had like a flourish of conversations about race and racism through sort of summer last year in response to George Floyd, in response to Black Lives Matter protests and all of that kind of being in the news and at the forefront of people's minds, I think the risk now is that as people feel like they're sort of going back to normal, or, you know, whatever normal ends up looking like, or people are thinking about, you know, returning to the office or you know, XYZ, going on holiday, kind of getting back to what things were like before, is that it stops becoming a topic of conversation again. That's the real risk, I think. So being comfortable, getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. We find as broadly as white people, although, you know, people of colour feel this way too, we are really rubbish about talking about race because it's not really seen as a topic of conversation that is kind of allowed or sort of okay to talk about, but we're not trained, we're not equipped to talk about it. So as a result, when you then start to think about these are things we need to talk about now, we need to get them out in the open and we need to, you know, start asking questions and doing things, all of that discomfort starts bubbling up and tries to get in the way of us doing anything and tries to prevent us from doing what feels uncomfortable for us. So we need to sort of be aware of it, but also we kind of need to welcome it. We need to recognize that that discomfort, if something feels uncomfortable when we're talking about race, it probably means we're talking about the right things, because so much of the context around race in terms of what's sort of okay to talk about and what up until very recently has been really not a topic of conversation, there's been a lot of silence around. It feels uncomfortable, A, because we're not used to it, but B, because we're kind of not meant to talk about it. So there's something very powerful in having it as a topic of conversation and recognizing that that discomfort is there, but working through it. So I wanted to just highlight the preliminary results from the bullying and harassment survey here because they are relevant to the talk today. So I'm just going to sort of go through some of the headlines. Now, obviously, this covers a breadth of people, including people with disabilities, LGBTQ+ people, women and non-binary people, etc. So from my perspective, in the work I do as an inclusion and diversity consultant, I will often do kind of surveys such as this, bits of research, data analysis, etc. And I would say the picture in astronomy and geophysics is not great. Like, this clearly needs work. There's some real issues here. But I would say that the patterns are very similar across a lot of other sectors and organisations. It's very, very common for people with disabilities, for BAME people, for women and non-binary people, for LGBTQ plus people to experience this stuff all the time. I think it's worth, as with all of these things, whenever you see a lot of data and it's sort of summarized, is to not fall into the trap of just kind of reading it all very quickly and going, oh yeah, okay, I've got a sense of that, but to actually spend a bit of time thinking about each section. So for instance, if we look at BAME astronomers and geophysicists, they're 40% more likely to be bullied than their white counterparts, which is a massive amount. I mean, no one should be being bullied at work. That's the kind of status quo that we should all aim for. But that is a huge disparity, 40% more likely. Similarly, when the question asked whether Black, mixed and other heritage respondents would recommend their workplace to colleagues in the field, a real difference in terms of how comfortable people would feel with recommending, particularly, as I say, Black, mixed and other heritage respondents. People of colour generally are more likely to have experienced bullying harassment during the last year, with 17% of Black, mixed and other ethnicities experiencing it at least once a week. So that's nearly 1 in 5 of Black, mixed and other ethnicity people experiencing bullying at least once a week. Now, if you've ever been on the receiving end of any kind of bullying, whether it's a sort of one-off event or whether it's over a longer period of time, you will know that it has an enormous impact on people. It is massively damaging, and it's just awful, just an awful thing to experience. So obviously you've got the sort of wider data report, and there's other work going on in this across the society, but I really want you to just remember that this is happening, and just keep this core to your sort of focus and your thoughts today, in terms of maybe what some of your colleagues or your peers across the sector are experiencing, and the action that needs to be taken to make a difference to this, because this isn't okay. Okay, so this is just a little thinking point for you. This is just something for you to sort of consider on your own for the next minute or so. So I'm going to talk about white privilege now. Now, as soon as I've said that, you might have found that some feelings, some emotions bubbled up for you. So you might have felt fear, you might have felt shame, that kind of sort of pit of your stomach feeling, that sort of, uh-oh, this isn't good. You might have felt anger, you might have felt skepticism. If you had any kind of emotional response to it, as soon as I said, white privilege is something we're going to be talking about, just log that, kind of recognize it in your head. White privilege can be a very hard topic to talk about, for people to think about. But remember what I was saying earlier about discomfort. If you had a strong response to white privilege, then that's a little flag for you that you need to do a bit of digging around in that and work out where that's coming from, what might be causing it, that kind of thing. You've got some work to do there. If you had no response at all, fine. It might be because it's not something you've thought about very much, or it might be something that you've kind of worked through and are okay with. But if you had an emotional response to it, that's kind of good, because it gives you a little sign that, okay, here's some work for me to do. Here's something I find uncomfortable. So white privilege, it's funny doing my job. So obviously I work in inclusion and diversity. I work with lots of different organisations talking about all different kinds of D&I topics. And privilege is the big thing that really gets a strong response from people. It sometimes really gets people's backs up, and I see it in training sessions and webinars and events like this. It can get a real powerful response from people. Before I talk through white privilege sort of specifically, privilege in and of itself, it's not intended as a sort of topic or subject area. It's not intended to be used as something to hit you around the head with. It's not intended to be used for self-flagellation. The purpose of thinking about privilege and the different ways in which we may or may not be privileged in certain spaces, so whether that's, you know, kind of our career or the sector we're in or our job role or our team or whatever it is, it's all part of that self-awareness piece. And it's all part of realizing that because of the way we are as humans, really, and the way our brains work, we experience the world the way we experience it, and we kind of assume everyone else experiences it the same way, but they don't. They experience it differently. So learning about and thinking about privilege is a kind of key to unlocking a lot of that self-awareness, and can just help you broaden your perspective when you're in certain spaces and think, how am I maybe experiencing this differently to others? How might I have more of a voice in this space, perhaps? You know, am I the person that everyone turns to in the meeting to answer the question? Am I the person who never gets interrupted, whereas my Black female colleague always does? Or, you know, whatever. Just helps us think about things in a more sort of complex and nuanced way. And then when you add on the word white and start talking about white privilege, then that can really get people's backs up. But again, it's thinking about the ways in which, if you are white, you will have, there'll be fewer obstacles in your way. Not none, because that's not how life works. No one has zero obstacles, but there'll be fewer obstacles in your way, and the ones that are in your way won't be there as a result of your race. Now, white privilege, you often don't realize you have it, because privilege is funny in that way, in that it's hard to see something that's just part of your normal, because that's just what life feels like for you. It can be hard to talk about white privilege because looking at whiteness generally feels uncomfortable, particularly if you are white. It's not really a topic of conversation, almost to the point where I think a lot of white people, it's quite common for us to see ourselves as almost like aracial, like we somehow don't have a race, or like we're the default or something, which, you know, isn't true, but that's the nature of the sort of systems that we're in, where we're presented as sort of the norm, not as sort of different or other. White privilege is a historical legacy and a cause of modern day racism. So there's obviously the historical legacy of white privilege and everything that's wrapped up in that in terms of UK and US history particularly. But it also causes sort of modern day racism. So white privilege is built into all of those kind of assumptions and hierarchies and power structures that put one person above another. It can manifest itself in lots of ways. It can, from kind of small interpersonal kind of assumptions, biases, a lack of kind of thinking beyond your own experience, not making inclusive decisions, through to kind of group prejudice towards people of colour backed by institutional power, bigger structural issues. It's kind of, you know, you can see it kind of everywhere. Now, I've quoted Peggy McIntosh here, who's worth reading. She writes very well. So she's, there's a couple of bits of work of hers that are really interesting. So there's Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, which is where she sort of talks about privilege more broadly. And this quote, I think whites are carefully taught not to recognise white privilege, just as males are taught not to recognise male privilege. So these privileges that some of us may have are kind of made invisible to us, or they're not sort of allowed to be topics of conversation, because as soon as we start examining them, then we can start challenging them, which is exactly what we need to do. So on this slide, with a missing speech bubble that I'll tell you about in a minute, are some everyday examples of white privilege. So I want you to have a read of these and just have a think about whether these are anything that you've thought about yourself before, whether your colleagues might have had to think about. Some of these might be very familiar to you. Some of these might be things that you've just not thought about before. the final one that for whatever reason is truncated, that just says I don't have to, is meant to say I don't have to consider whether my race affects my career prospects. So obviously these are literally, you know, everyday kind of prosaic examples, but they're also cumulative. So if you have white privilege, it's quite possible that none of these things are really anything you've had to think about before or had to consider. It won't mean there isn't other things for you to think about, maybe in terms of your gender or your socioeconomic background or, you know, other aspects of our identity and who we are. But when it comes to race, these things may not have crossed your mind at all. Those of you on the call who aren't white, who are, you know, sort of people of colour, who are Black and other ethnic minorities, may well recognise a lot of these. They may chime with you, or they may chime with, you know, your friends, your family, your colleagues. So these are sort of everyday kind of prosaic examples, but I also want us, as I've been kind of hinting at all the way through, about the link between individual and institutional. So like I said right back at the beginning, there's a few things here. Partly we start with the individual, so we start with ourselves when it comes to being anti-racist. We sort of do that work of self-awareness, and that's always sort of central to what we're doing. It's absolutely tipping it down. I hope you can't hear it, but it's really, really loud. So if you can hear what sounds like rain in the background, that's because it's decided to chuck it down with rain. So we've got the individual, but then of course that feeds into institutional and structural. So this model here is called the lens of systemic oppression. And it's from the National Equity Project. And I find it a really helpful model to remind us to think about individual and institutional factors when it comes to racism, and to always be kind of trying to think of both those factors. The key point here, kind of like as we were talking about at the start, is that change is possible. All of these things are learned. You know, we don't come out of the womb. We're not born with sort of racism and prejudice coded into us. We learn it from the situations that we're in, and because we learn it, that means we can unlearn it. So that's the sort of key message here, is that none of this has to be fixed. We can change it and we can challenge it. So just to sort of think about this model then, from the National Equity Project, starting on the left, we've got individual factors. So these are the sort of beliefs and perspectives that we carry around and that therefore affect our actions that serve to perpetuate oppression. Now, a few key bits here. These are both our conscious beliefs and our unconscious ones. Now, it's very, very possible, in fact, very common, that your conscious beliefs and values about the world, you know, wanting it to be fair and equitable, not wanting to be racist, contradict some of your unconscious beliefs and values and perspectives, because your unconscious ones are the ones that are hiding in there, that you've soaked up from the society that you're in, from the media that you consume, from, you know, the communities we live in, etc. And those two things are often conflicting, but they both affect how we behave. And it's also the externalized and internalized behaviors. So it's the stuff that we kind of show to others, I suppose, in our behaviors, but it's also sort of what's going on in here and how that might be affecting how we behave. We've obviously got interpersonal in the middle. So this is how racism can show itself in the interactions between people, both within and across difference. So in different groups, again, thinking back to what we were saying earlier about kind of intersectionality and always trying to think in an expansive way about people's perspectives, there will be, you know, not wanting to do sort of death by Venn diagram, but there'll be lots of overlaying kind of similarities and also not similarities, differences in between people that will affect those interpersonal sort of behaviors and communication. And then we've got the systemic stuff. So we've got institutional. So this is the policies, the practices of an organization or a sector that perpetuate oppression. So this is where you're thinking about both your maybe institution that you work in or your employer, but also the sector as a whole. What's the messaging around race in the sector as a whole? Is it talked about enough? Is it something that is sort of paid lip service to, but actually real action isn't happening yet? Some things for you to think about. And then there's the biggest picture, which is structural. So that's how sort of all of these things interact and accumulate across institutions and across history. Now, again, worth reminding ourselves here that this all starts with the individual, but the individual can influence the other things. So we can change individuals, therefore we can change interpersonal interactions, therefore we can change institutions and eventually change structures. Obviously, this all takes time. It's not something we can do overnight, but it is all possible. That change is possible. Right, so we're going to have another go at Slido now, and hopefully it won't eat half of your responses this time. It will behave itself. So exactly the same as last time, same code. What might you or your colleagues find talking about white privilege? Why might you or your colleagues find talking about white privilege challenging? So what might the particular challenges be for you and your colleagues to have this as a topic of conversation? So I'll give you a few minutes to scan the code and get on the Slido.
Addy, the poll isn't active.
Oh,
no, it is now.
I was going to say, how about now?
It is now. Okay.
Helen, can I have you on all of my webinars to keep my tech working? Because you're very, very helpful.
Oh, am I?
Yeah.
There's a new job for me there.
I'll talk to you afterwards. So using the same code, 641880 on slido.com, why might you or your colleagues find talking about white privilege challenging? So let's have some responses in here. It has stopped tipping it down with rain, so that's good news. Yeah, so range of responses so far. People not believing it's real. So again, I was mentioning earlier, you know, white privilege can have people can have really strong responses to hearing it. It doesn't help that a lot of the media discussion around white privilege is very oversimplified. Fear of being seen as racist, people feeling guilt. Guilt is a big thing. Certain maybe older colleagues or certain groups not believing it's something, it's a thing in the UK, you know, we're not racist anymore, we're past racism now. That's a good way to phrase it, misinterpreting white privilege as something they had a hand in creating. Guilt coming up a lot here, definitely. Yeah, people don't always feel like they have any privilege whatsoever, because we tend to focus on what we don't have. That's absolutely right. All my colleagues are white and I fear breaking the illusion our group is a happy family. So again, thinking back to the previous talk, that, you know, being that person, being the person who brings it up as a topic of conversation. Invisibility through ubiquity. I'm loving the way so many of you are phrasing these. They're amazing. So work is already an atomizing and alienating place, and this is just, you know, another thing on top. That's very, very honest. Wondering if we would be where we are without it. To have any kind of challenging conversations, you need the basics of rapport, respect, and trust. That's a very good point. Yep. So you need to think about kind of psychological safety when it comes to these things. Yep. So some colleagues having certain ideas about who might raise these topics of conversation. Yeah, exactly. Society produces white fragility or white guilt as a defense mechanism to stop us talking about it. Yeah, and that's all that discomfort as well. You know, it's all there to try and stop us from talking about it. As a person of colour, fear of backlash in the form of gaslighting, being labelled sensitive. Yep, absolutely. Admission of privilege is painful. People feeling that they're under attack, sorry. Yes, people equating all forms of privilege as the same thing. I came from a working class background, therefore I'm not privileged. Yeah, and like I say, that's one of the real challenges, is talking about privilege actually, and one of the risks of it being out in the public eye, particularly on social media, is that things get so simplified and just made into very simple us versus them issues, whereas actually they're really complex. So I'm from a working class background, so my route to where I am now wasn't, you know, there were barriers and stuff there. I've got other things going on, but I'm able to recognize that those things would have been so much harder had I not been white. But it takes a while for someone to get to that place. And I think the way that privilege is talked about as a very on and off thing, you're privileged, you're not, whereas actually it's much more complex than that, and we all have different areas in which we might be more privileged or not, makes it too simple. And then people just block off and don't want to listen to it. A lot of fear in here as well. So if we think back to the point we were making earlier about seeing racism as an individual kind of moral failing, that's where some of that comes in. So because we tend to think about racism as people are racist. So someone will do something racist, therefore they are a racist person, therefore they should be cast out and they can never be redeemed. Because we see racism in that very simplistic way, it becomes terrifying to be what we feel as being labelled racist, and it becomes very hard for us to admit, as particularly as white people, that we probably are racist because we grew up in a racist society, just as we'll have sexist and homophobic and ableist ideas in our heads as well, because that's the society we grow up in, regardless of whether we fall into those categories or not. But what it does is it stops us from going on that kind of self-awareness journey and doing something about it. Yeah, bringing it up and initiating the conversations is hard. Again, thinking about the discomfort point, we are not trained to talk about this. We're not, equipped. We're not given the tools. We have to kind of work it out, and it's hard. It's hard to do. Yeah, exactly. So because being called racist is a kind of a label, an accusation that we feel, will throw us out of society and will never come back, it means people just go straight into defense mode and then can't listen to what's actually being said, because, as you say, all of those feelings come up, guilt and pain and shame and all that kind of thing. And then we're not going to have a constructive conversation if that's happening. Wonderful, thank you. So some of the ways that white privilege can show itself in terms of sort of white fragility is one way to label this. You can sort of categorize them into 4 kind of distinct groups, really. And you may well have seen or heard a lot of these yourselves. You might have even found yourself saying some of these things before. If that's the case, again, log it. It's part of that self-awareness piece. It's not about going, oh, I've said one of these things, therefore I'm a terribly irredeemable person, I need to go and live under a rock. It's about going, I've said or thought that before. Okay, I need to work on that. I need to do some thinking and not do it again. That's the approach to have. It's about progressive improvement. It's not about self-flagellation. It's hard to say. So diminishing. So back in my day, we didn't have to worry about these things, or it was just a joke. So diminishing the seriousness of what's being said or the topic of conversation. What it does is diminish the feelings of people of colour, of Black and ethnic minority people, because what it's really saying to them is what you've just raised to me, or what you think is an issue, or the Black Lives Matter movement, or whatever it is not important as far as I'm concerned. Dismissing. So this is where, say you're trying to talk about an instance of racism. So as an example, in the Olympics, we've had a fair bit of discussion, some helpful, some not, about Simone Biles. So incredibly talented, one of the potentially the best gymnasts of all time, and the various sort of barriers and difficulties she's had, partly with her mental health and kind of prioritizing that, but actually mostly in the fact that she's prioritizing her mental health, and people are then telling her, normally white men, are telling her that she's being weak, or she's not taking it seriously enough, or she should compete, or all of that nonsense. This dismissal happens a lot, particularly towards Black women. So a few of you mentioned maybe older colleagues not feeling that this is a sort of relevant topic of conversation anymore, this idea that we're somehow sort of post-racial now that it's 2021, that we sort of magically went past racism at some point in the 90s. So this is saying things, yeah, racism doesn't exist anymore. It's not always about race. why are you bringing up the race card? It's not because of that, it's because of X, Y, Z. And this is essentially a form of gaslighting, really. What it's doing is getting people to question their own reality or their own perception of things. Also saying things like, oh, you sure that's what happens? I'm sure they didn't mean it that way. And again, this dismissal, what this does is say to the person raising the topic, particularly if they're a sort of person of colour, a black or ethnic minority person, that I don't really want to hear what you have to say, and I don't actually believe things that you're raising. So if we think back to that slide about experiences of bullying and harassment in the sector, it's quite likely that this is happening. You know, people may well be raising things and it's not getting listened to, or it's, oh, you know, he didn't mean it, or, oh, he was just having a bad day, or, you know, all of that kind of thing, dismissing those things being raised. Derailing. So this is where you try and make the topic about something else, basically. We're not all racist, or the lovely all lives matter, which was a kind of standard response of some people for a while last year. So derailing happens because the individual is not comfortable with the topic of conversation. So they're trying to derail it onto something else. It often comes from a feeling of kind of being left out. So you know, all lives matter, or we're not all racist, or, you know, I don't know why we have to think about race so much. Why can't everyone be free and equal? You know, that kind of thing. Derailing often comes from a sense that that they feel ignored, and that's coming from a place or an experience in them. The thing with derailing is that obviously if you're on the receiving end of it, it's very infuriating, but it's worth thinking about, if you're trying to think about that bigger picture all the time, of, is there someone here who actually feels like maybe they've got some things to raise, or they've had barriers, or they've got stuff going on in their life and it's not being listened to, and it's coming out in this way, which is not great. They're kind of, you know, sticking their foot in it, but is it coming from something else? And then there's good old ignoring it. So just sort of assuming that if you say, I don't see colour, or, oh, it doesn't matter what race you are to me, that magically this will remove all of racism and get rid of all those structures. If only it was that simple. And again, this may well be coming from a good place, from a sense of someone is trying to say, look, it doesn't, your race, or, you know, the race of my colleagues or whatever it is, doesn't affect how I see them. The problem is they're solely viewing it from their perspective, and they've not stepped into a space of empathy where they're able to go, okay, so maybe this isn't something that I've thought about before, but for you, this is really important. Okay. On to the next slide. There we go. Okay, so breaking the cycle. So this is something to think about, the kind of cycle of discomfort, really, when it comes to talking about race as a topic of conversation, or even something like, you know, raising the points made in the sort of bullying and harassment report. So we sort of start top right, and then it just goes round and round and round. So racism is raised as a topic of conversation. So it could be the Black Lives Matter movement. It could be Simone Biles and Naomi Osaka's treatment in the last few months by the press as Black women. You know, whatever it is, it's raised. Immediately, white people become uncomfortable. So as a result of all the things we were talking about earlier, that lack of skill in talking about race, that guilt, fear that you're going to get labelled a racist yourself, all of that stuff, all that gets in the way. And if you think back, those of you that recognised when I said we're going to talk about white privilege, and you might have had that emotional response come up for you, you know, it comes up pretty blooming fast. It doesn't waste its time. So that immediately comes up, and then we want to go into that defensive space to protect ourselves. So discomfort happens because the topic has been raised, we don't feel comfortable with the topic, we don't want to talk about it, etc. So then those behaviours start appearing. So the diminishing, the dismissing, the derailing, the ignoring, those kind of things, they start happening because essentially what people are trying to do is just get away from the discomfort, basically, because it doesn't feel nice. If that works, the topic goes away in that it's not a topic of conversation. Obviously, it doesn't go away. Nothing is addressed. No change happens. And we return to that sort of comfortable status quo, comfortable for white people, of that silence of, you know, we don't talk about racism. It's not a topic that we talk about as a group. There are racists out there, but they're very far away and they, you know, aren't part of who we are, and there's nothing for us to examine and think about. And you can just go round and round and round in this nice little cycle over and over. So what you need to think about is, how can we step in and break this cycle? How can we stop it going round and round? So we're going to raise racism as a topic of conversation. There's lots of different ways that you can do that, but trying to get it on the agenda, start making it something people talk about. Anticipating that that discomfort's going to come up and that people might become defensive, they might shut down, they might say all sorts of interesting things, because what they're really trying to do is not feel uncomfortable. They're trying to get away from that unpleasant feeling. Spotting those diminish, dismiss, derail or ignore strategies, and recognizing that they're coming from a place of discomfort and not wanting to talk about this because it doesn't feel good, because we don't know how to talk about it. You've got some powerful stuff in there. You know, you've got people's sort of fear and guilt and shame, really powerful emotions that get in the way of this. Topic goes away. So this is the bit you want to be stepping in at these points. So maybe where white people become uncomfortable, you might want to step in and call that out, you know, say consciously, loudly, this is going to be uncomfortable. A little bit like I said with you, you know, when those emotions come up, when you might hear the word white privilege, or you might think about some of these topics, noticing them and going, oh, that's a thing, interesting. I see you there, bit of discomfort or bit of guilt or shame or, you know, anger or whatever it is, I've spotted you. Even just doing that sometimes is enough to make it manageable, but being prepared for those emotions to come up. Thinking about ways to handle these behaviours, you know, diminish, dismiss, derail or ignore. Core thing here is not, or trying your hardest not to let your colleagues who are people of colour, who are Black and ethnic minority, have to hear this stuff. So if you're another white person, you should be trying to handle this and taking that burden away from your colleagues who are people of colour, who are Black and ethnic minority, especially if you've got a fair bit of privilege. So that might be to do with maybe the seniority of your role, or you might be particularly well respected in your team, or you might have a fair bit of privilege in terms of your, you know, a white male who went to a very good university and you're kind of respected in your field. You've got a voice, you've got power here. So use it to protect your colleagues from having to hear this stuff and handle it on their own, and use it to constructively challenge people around you. So really the sort of summary of all of this is that becoming anti-racist is about 2 steps. I'm not saying they're small steps, they're big steps, but becoming conscious. So it's that self-work first, right? Look inside yourself first, learn about yourself, uncover this stuff and where it's hiding. Now that's not a one-time only action. That's something you'll be doing your whole life. You know, that's I work in the area of D&I, and one of my kind of ongoing bits of work is I do a fortnightly kind of anti-racism reading group with a group of my white friends, and we sort of pick through this stuff and examine it and learn. So it's always sort of there for us. It's a kind of backbone to what we do. And then challenge, so challenging others, not in a you're a horrible racist kind of way, but in a way that gets them to change their behavior, to engage with their empathy, to think outside of their own experience a bit. And that's where, if we're thinking back to that model earlier, where we're thinking about kind of individual, interpersonal, institutional, that's where we start making that change. So I'm just conscious of time, and I know there's a couple of questions. So just to sort of summarize then, always coming back to the idea that inaction is an action, all right? So doing nothing is not nothing. You're still doing something. You're still sort of supporting the status quo, basically. So what you need to do is identify what's in your gift, what's in your power to do to make a difference. And that will really vary. And that's kind of why the self-awareness bit comes first. It will vary depending on who you are, on your role, on your status, sort of maybe what platforms you've got. But sort of think through these actions and kind of consider what you could do. So making a plan for how to address that discomfort, that white discomfort that comes up when we talk about race. So the diminish, dismiss, derail, that cycle, trying to interrupt that cycle of discomfort. Acting on your own privilege. So learning a bit more about what your privileges are and are not. You know, there's going to be a range of things in there. But really thinking about it in a more sort of complex and nuanced way, and thinking about how you can use it to make a difference. Identify individual and institutional actions. And again, depending on kind of your role and various other things will vary as to what things you've got impact on, but thinking about what those things could be. And avoid the sort of goodwill approach. So don't just do things because it's nice or because they're open-ended. Be really solution focused, be impact focused. What are you actually trying to do? What are you actually trying to change? So it's not enough to just have a bit of a conversation about race every now and again, and that's it. Think about actually what change do we want to have happen? So a really good point one of you made is that if you're going to talk about these kind of topics, you need a good sort of solid foundation of kind of trust and rapport amongst a group. So work on that first, build that first, and then think about what a kind of solution focused discussion might be once you've got that sort of kind of psychological safety really in place. So a little thinking point while I have a look at the questions and see what's come through is what actions you're going to take as a result of this session. I mean, this is something you could do at the end of today anyway, is note down some actions that you're going to take. Think about who you could connect with, who you could work with, what's in your gift, whom you might need to influence, etc. But kind of jotting down a few actions for yourself while we review the questions.
Thank you so much, Addie. That was amazing. So much to reflect on, and also thanks everyone attending for really getting involved with the Slido and stuff like that. So it was amazing. So we're now going to have the wonderful Divya and Persaud. Divya is a planetary geologist, artist, speaker and organizer. She is a postdoctoral scholar supporting the Europa Lander concept and Europa Clipper missions, and has been completing her PhD at UCL, where she is applying 3D imagery to probe Martian geology. Divya has spoken and worked internationally on issues surrounding the historic and cultural context of space exploration. For example, through her work with the Just Space Alliance and as a co-organizer of the conference Space Science in Context, which seeks to bring together social and space scientists to address social issues pertaining to space. Divya's session today is going to explore the colonial heritage and future of astronomy and geophysics. And thank you so much to Divya doing this on California time currently. So massive thanks for doing this. I guess 7 a.m. or something, 6 a.m., something ridiculous like that. So huge thanks to Divya, and take it away.
Thanks so much, Anya, for that introduction. Yeah, I'm happy to be here this morning, and thank you for having me. And let me just share my screen. And so you see that?
Yeah, perfect.
Great. All right. Yeah, thanks so much. So I just want to start out with a land acknowledgement now that I'm in the US. So I just want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you as a guest on the land belonging to the Tongva and Keys people in what is now called Pasadena in California. And I hope to continue to learn how to better honor these peoples and lands and be a better steward in my time here, both in my research and beyond. And to that, what does colonialism have to do with space? And I don't say that trivially. I don't mean it to be a joke. I really do mean it. I get asked this question a lot, whether it's kids, whether it's students, if it's people in my family, if it's senior academics, both genuinely and bad faith, the whole spectrum. And it's a really important question, and it doesn't have a simple answer. And so today I'm hoping to talk through just some of the components of that answer, because the answer does have a really widespread of topics it touches on, of philosophy, of science, of history of science, ethics. And it is hard to grasp. It is hard to see the bigger picture in what we do with respect to colonialism. So one of the main arguments that I hear is that space, because it's uninhabited, meaning by sentient beings that are visible in our solar system, right? We can't draw that into any sort of parallel or comparison with colonialism on Earth. So in a lot of discussions about space and colonialism, this tends to be an argument of, does it really matter if no one's out there? And when it comes to like bacteria on Mars or something, that goes into the realm of planetary protection, of technologies to prevent us contaminating other bodies, and that's kind of treated as separate from this. And so I want to walk through 3 different answers to this, and we'll get sort of progressively, we'll add up the previous answers and get a bit more complex at the end, because I just want to walk us through the general concepts, which are often complex and deal with a lot of other fields. So I'm going to use this image as a thought exercise, and I'm going to explain this image first. This picture is from my PhD. It's of an ancient riverbed on Mars. I'm not going to talk about my science today, but it's based on space imagery. It was orbital imagery taken from a spaceborne camera system in orbit around Mars at a very high resolution, and then rendered in 3D, processed in 3D, and then rendered by me in a 3D visualization software to do geological measurements, whatever. And the point is that I've explained that image in that way. And that was a choice. And that choice was informed by a lot of things. So I spoke to you as a scientist. I said spaceborne camera, orbital geology, visualization, 3D imagery, ancient riverbed. And I want to deconstruct all of those things. And I'm going to do that very slowly throughout this presentation. I'm going to keep showing you this image and start talking about different aspects of it. Because we can say it's an image, and as a geologist, I look at specific things in this image. I look at texture and lighting and stuff, but an engineer would look at something else. An engineer would say, this looks hazardous, this looks infeasible, or this looks like it needs certain wheels if a rover's going to travel through it. Just as a regular person who's not a scientist would think something completely different looking at this. And so I want to try to get us to start thinking about how science isn't actually the only truth out there, or our science is just one of many sciences. So the first sort of part of our answer of what does it mean that there is a connection between colonialism and space is the idea of labor. And that's a broad answer, and I'm going to deconstruct that as well. So if we look at this photo, when I say labor, I'm talking about what work went into this photo. What work did I do, for example? But then going even further back, who built the camera system that was on the spacecraft that took the images that were processed by me to be visualized? Who built the launch vehicle that launched that spacecraft? Where was that vehicle constructed and from what components? Who mined those materials for those components? Right, so we're starting to break down what we view as scientific products, things that we would use on the day-to-day. I understand not everyone here is a planetary scientist, but think of any sort of image or data product that you get from a spacecraft. And so we sort of think about the work that goes into it as the processing and the downlinking and maybe some onboard processing and maybe our friends who were the engineers on the camera or whatever, the detector. But I want us to go all the way back to what does it mean for that image to have been produced? So when we talk about space activities, a lot of those activities, as I've explained, are performed on Earth. And this is something that a lot of people have talked about of, for example, asteroid mining, which I'll get into, or lunar bases, whatever. We sort of think that we can send ourselves out there and we are out there, but actually most of the work is done here on Earth, right? So this is from building the rockets, but also the mining of rare earth minerals for electronics components, nuclear processing, launch facilities. And this labor actually has a direct connection with empire. And that's the connection that I want to draw for you. So here's a little map of launch sites, rocket launch sites on Earth. And I want us to look at where are launch facilities? we want to think about where are we putting telescopes and why? Where do we do field work and why? And what are the politics of us building those things, going to those places, taking those samples? And what is the nature of resistance to these projects? So I'm assuming that a lot of you have heard about protests of particularly telescopes in this community. There have been many, many protests of launch facilities from this year going back to the 60s and probably before then. And that's just for space and not even contending with military launch facilities, which has a very, very long history of protests. And so going to who has built our spacecraft, here's just one component of that. So Alice Gorman wrote a fantastic piece in 2005. And this is sort of a dark history. I'm coming from the US perspective of things, but the UK has had a similar heritage where one of the primary proponents of rocket development in the US was actually a Nazi who was absolved of all of his crimes and sort of saved and moved to the US. And he had a history of using slavery to develop rockets in Germany. So it was multiple thousands from concentration camps that he employed, most of whom died, well, a great number of whom died in those conditions, developing and manufacturing the V2 rocket, which greatly influenced all the rockets that have come since, if you know sort of rocket development history. So now we're really trying to get you to think about whose hands have been building our rockets. And it doesn't just mean this year, it means back at this point in time. What is the heritage of these things being built and how does that influence how it's done now? So most Western space programs were born out of political conflict, right? This has been our legacy. And most people think, okay, it's just really the US and the Soviet Union, but that's not really true. The space race involved many, many countries, and the UK was embedded in that. And most aerospace companies that built spacecraft and still do build spacecraft or launch vehicles also build craft for warfare. And that's kind of where that connection started, right? And other aspects of space science and engineering have historic and modern connections to the military operations. And that directly includes colonialism. So I'm talking about military occupation of other countries. A lot of this is uncomfortable topics, and I haven't actually gone too in depth with this because there's so much content to get through. But the entire coincidence with British imperialism in the 20th century with rocket development. So most of British colonies got independence between 1948 and about 1975. That was also the period of quite a lot of space technology development. And that's not a coincidence. And those technologies were related to being developed or being launched from existing colonies or former colonies. And I'll also get into that as well. This was a political cartoon that I found that was really fascinating and interesting. So if you don't know the photo, it's a picture of, the original photo is of American soldiers raising the American flag during World War II. And it's this representative of not just an astronaut, but colonists raising the flag on the moon. So now touching on facilities, and I mentioned facilities and colonies or former colonies, a lot of the placement of launch facilities and telescopes has been very deliberate. It's not just sort of where there's a clear sky. I want to sort of deconstruct what that means. Clear sky kind of means an empty place, right? It has depended on a predetermined emptiness. And I'm totally acknowledging that we need dark skies to use telescopes. That's totally true. That's acceptable. But where do we get our understandings of emptiness? And I don't just mean emptiness of light. I mean emptiness of people. The idea of the emptiness of land, which is the emptiness of people, is actually a colonial policy called terra nullius. Terra nullius literally means land of nobody. And so this concept was socially and politically constructed. So most terrain on this planet has been touched by humans in some way. It's sort of this mythology that there are untouched places on this earth. Sure, maybe Antarctica, but even then there have been there has been evidence of migration down to close to the islands around Antarctica, right? The Amazon is considered untouched, even though it is really a garden that indigenous people have tended to for thousands of years. And so the development, going to the history of where this comes from, the development of modern empire, which started about the 15th century, is really tied to the Enlightenment. I'm going to talk about the Enlightenment a lot. And that included science. And so this policy was born out of this movement outwards, right? And it was used to justify claiming of that land, right? So going to North America and saying, oh, but it's just empty. And of course it wasn't. There were millions of people living in North America. And if you call something empty, if you go scout out in a land and you write a little letter to the king saying this land is empty, then the king will send more colonists, right? So it was used to justify the placement of people there, while indigenous people can justifiably be exploited or enslaved, extracted, forcibly migrated, or killed. And this isn't just North America, this is in a lot of places. So I'm going to talk about settler colonialism actually later, just because I want to slowly introduce us into these things. So if we think about terra nullius and the role of scientists, there actually is a really big role. So early modern biology and geology, which was just called naturalism really, or natural philosophy, that work was in service to monarchies to determine land as empty. So a lot of early geology in North America, for example, was done in the service of cartography. It was determining how empty the land was, determining the natural resources of that land, never really talking about people. It's not contending with people. And if you think about that being the seed of modern geology, of the natural world in absence of humans, that's really interesting. And I won't talk about that. That's for another time. But this is sort of self-fulfilling, right? If indigenous land is treated as this sort of scientific playground, and this became a legacy, right? So all through the 19th century, you get all these fascinating British books of these adventurers going to the Amazon and looking for gold. And it's usually these boys' stories of terror and intrigue that are novelistic, but also autobiographical. So these scientists are usually employed to scout out resources for the monarchy or for a company. And then that further enables more people to come in, or for genocidal policies to be in place. And we see that quite a lot in South America, which is where I'm from. So even natural history was separated from the actions of these people, right? So we think, again, going back to the Amazon, which is cultivated, we think of this sort of natural phenomenon that's just appeared out of nowhere that we have to protect. When in fact, indigenous people are the original stewards and have to remain the stewards of that land. So going to launch facilities and terra nullius. So in Australia, the Woomera launch facility was considered a good choice for a rocket range in 1947 because it was considered remote. And that was a big factor in Australia and the American West, North Africa. That was considered that if it's sort of sandy and dry, people aren't there. Of course, people were there. Millions of people were there. They had rich cultures and still do. And but that was the official policy. And so that's what justified putting a rocket range. And rockets aren't really sort of, it's not like putting a little garden there, right? A rocket range is dangerous. Rockets explode, especially in 1947, where the technology wasn't that great. And even now, rockets don't really succeed all that much. So, and then going to French Guiana. So this may be familiar to some of you who work with data from certain spacecraft. France has a colony, French Guiana, in South America. And in French Guiana is the Guyana Space Center. And that's used to launch the Ariane rocket program. And Peter Redfield wrote several books. He's amazing, you should read his work. Did a lot of ethnography of the people in French Guiana and the reactions to the building of this facility. And so I just pulled one quote, which is, what use is the Guyana Space Center to us, she asked. The road has existed prior to CSG, that's the company's arrival, and suggested that it would also exist after the center's departure. What do we get? Color TV, but they still think we're savages. And the road refers to the fact that one of the main one of the main commercial roads in French Guiana was where this space center was built. So again, consider that rockets explode. People were worried about their safety, and so this was protested. This was protested quite a lot, and it still is. It's still considered a safety issue, and it's still also considered France sort of recolonizing French Guiana after most of the Caribbean has had its independence for decades. So sort of moving away from that, going towards resources and just sort of thinking towards the future. A lot of people talk about resource extraction out in space. Here's a little graphic from Planetary Resources, which actually went out of business, I think, last year. But the idea is that a lot of planetary bodies, such as the moon, are rich in valuable materials like titanium or zinc, tin, gold, platinum, whatever. And this is just, again, sort of a thought exercise for us. The idea that asteroids have all these materials and all these companies racing to extract these materials. But what does that actually mean for them to extract them? What does mining sort of look like on Earth as it is? Who's actually doing the mining? Who's actually processing the toxic chemicals used to refine those materials? It's not people with PhDs, it's not you and me. It's people who are underpaid, who are underrepresented, who don't have healthcare, who are being exploited by companies, who have their lands taken from them and destroyed, right? And that's sort of pretty sweeping. We see it in the Congo with cobalt mining. We see it in South America with quite a lot of mining. And so I want us to think about, okay, going forward, the thought of expansion, the thought of expanding our industry, what does that actually mean for the human labor here on Earth that will mostly be taking care of that? And will it be equitable? So again, this is an extreme example, and it's probably improbable, honestly, right? But I just want us to think about these things and think about it in the context of launch facilities. Think about it in context of telescopes. And also just coming back to the UK, I've used a lot of US examples here, understandably. We might think that Europe has kind of moved on from these legacies or removed from what the US is doing, but it's very much not true. A lot of these partnerships still exist. A lot of European companies still operate in the global South in a very similar way. Most of the colonial capital infrastructure still exists. Again, like French Guiana does not have independence, right? Partnerships with Hawaiian and other telescopes still exist, while Hawaii is still unceded land that America is occupying. And even like the travel and the field work that we do, field work, for example, in the Arctic, a lot of geophysics research in, for example, Svalbard that has an indigenous population. What are the choices that we are sort of conditioned to make? Why is our field sort of structured in that way? It kind of comes back to some of these core issues that I'm going to talk about a bit more. So going to politics on Earth and coming back to this picture, I swear I'm not plugging my PhD here at all. So thinking about, again, where this image comes from, what were the countries involved in getting this spacecraft flying that took this image? What dictates their political relationships? How will this play out with human exploration? If this is sort of the precedent of political collaboration between countries, what is it going to look like when people are on Mars or on the moon? So this is an exercise I often give students, and it's a lot of fun. So imagine that you have a camp of astronauts and every single one is from a different country. What happens if I steal a granola bar from my neighbor? What if I'm from a country like French Guiana that is currently occupied by their country, for example, France? How is that legislated? What happens if I'm starving and this person is super fit and I need the food more than they do? How is that arbitrated? There is no neat and tidy answer here, right? And it gets into, however, the core idea of we don't leave our politics behind just because we are on the beautiful red sands of Mars, right? Our politics will directly inform what happens in space because we are the countries, we are the societies. And a lot of people argue, again, that when we go to space, we leave all of this behind. We leave the conflict behind, we leave the hierarchy behind. And I think that's a beautiful thought. It's a thought that a lot of astronauts have expressed in going to the ISS, in especially politically fraught times of thinking, you know, why do we have racial discrimination when you look at the planet and it's so fragile? And so I'm not dismissing that. I think that's related. I think that's really, really important. But the idea is that when you go to the ISS, there are things that dictate your relationships with your neighbors, and there are politics that have gotten you there. And that's really, really important. So we as humans, just because we're on Mars, doesn't mean that we don't have all the social relations that come with being a human from Earth, right? The political orders that we come with, that we carry with ourselves. There will be a hierarchy if I'm an astronaut who's American and there are astronauts around me who are from the global South. That's just going to happen. So even if space in the future transforms our borders or political relations in any way, as I hope they do, those changes will still be to the status quo. They won't just come out of nowhere, right? So this sounds kind of basic, but I want to get to that sort of philosophical point of that we can't just escape our social relationships with each other just because we're physically somewhere else. So just, you know, think of space as going to a different house. That's basically what it is if we're talking about how much our political relationships are going to change. Now, the thing that's unique about space is that if we are representatives of our countries, then it becomes even more exaggerated. We have to be, the diplomacy will change, right? So I wrote the expanse is where our social conditions, our structures, and our processes are writ large. They become more important, they become more immediate, right? It's not the same as going to a grocery store where there are loads of other people and you have your social mores about, you know, don't elbow someone in line. You're living in a habitat with someone. And so these things become very important. And so Redfield wrote, I love this quote, placeless space is not free from culture or social norms, even it blurs location. And so getting into sort of the legislation question, I love this comic. I would encourage you to look it up. It's called Who Owns an Asteroid? So it's bringing up the Outer Space Treaty and who would enforce it. I'm going to talk about the Outer Space Treaty a little bit. So this was a document from 1967, from the United Nations, and it was a set of laws which prevents nations from putting or testing weapons of mass destruction in space, carrying out military activities in space, or claiming any planetary body as their own. And any company that goes into space is the responsibility of its country. And here's a tidy little map. Green are the parties to the treaty, yellow are the signatories who signed it but didn't ratify it, and red are non-parties. So the Outer Space Treaty was generally accepted, I would say. It is still really fraught, and if you go into the space law realm, I don't know enough about space law to really comment on it, but it's quite controversial still. The idea that companies have to represent countries, for example, and also military activities. And the idea that the US has possibly crossed that line, and possibly Europe has also crossed that line. There was a follow-up to the Outer Space Treaty called the Moon Treaty in 1979. And this was a lot more stringent. It would ban military use of planetary bodies. It would ban altering environment of these bodies, which would have to be defined. Exploration without demonstrated global benefit. And also any sort of return samples would be shared. So combining that with demonstrated global benefit, really concerned about disseminating information and with collaboration, and equal rights to space research as well. And this was not passed because the UN member states who even had the capacity to go into space, which was the US, most of Europe, the UK, and the USSR, would not sign it. And a lot of countries who didn't have the capacities also didn't sign it. But it's still sort of this lesson of what lines won't we cross, and also a lesson in the fact that this is an ongoing problem. It's an ongoing conversation of how do we legislate political activities in space, our relationships with each other. And that might be on the grand scale, but when you think of humans interacting with each other in space, or even interacting on the ground, doing all that labor that I was describing for these companies that may be operating in other countries, it's very, very interesting, right? What does it mean for equal rights to space research for the person who's mining cobalt for something or another, right? So I just want to kind of get us thinking about what politics we take with ourselves. And then I want to get into settler colonialism as the culmination of those two things. And I want to also get a lot more abstract. I want to ask, is science objective? Looking at this picture again, is science objective? Is knowledge objective? Is nature objective? What does it mean to want to go here? If you want to go here, I do. What does it mean to know here? What does it mean for me to look at this channel and say, oh, I know this channel very well. I know all the stratigraphy in this channel very well. Is it human nature to want to go here? Is it human nature to want to know here? So getting a lot more abstract, and hopefully you'll stay with me on this. So many argue that space exploration is the next stage in two things. One is the human exploration of nature. So the next step of our journey in exploring, whatever that means. And also our next stage in expanding science as the next step of understanding the world around us. Space challenges a lot of our understanding of physics and chemistry and geology. So space is considered a literal, a physical, and also a philosophical frontier. And by philosophical, I mean with regards to us growing our knowledge about the world around us. And I use frontier with quotes. And the reason I do that is, hold on, the reason I put quotes around frontier is because I want to problematize the way we talk about space. So when it comes to launch facilities and field sites, there is a direct relationship between indigenous people and their rights, settler colonialism, and colonial entitlement to physical space on Earth to reach outer space, right? France didn't just choose a random spot on the planet to put a launch facility. It put a launch facility in its colony. The United States didn't put launch facilities in random places in the US. It put it on reservations in the Navajo Nation, for example, or on Guam, which it currently occupies, or Hawaii, which it currently occupies, or Puerto Rico, which it currently occupies. The list goes on. So there are all these examples, right? But how much of this is also embedded in how we perceive our work? And I want to start with our perceptions and how they manifest in how we talk about space. So let's look at terms like frontier and colonialism and space settlement, right? So to define settler colonialism isn't trivial. So I just wanted to take a step back and talk about that. Settler colonialism describes the process where foreign invaders replace or displace indigenous people. And there are many aspects and tactics to settler colonialism. And it's not just one singular process. And it's not very simple. It's economic, it is damage to natural resources, it's environmental disaster, it's genocide, it's the propaganda, it's the social forces as well. It's very psychological. And so here's a map on the right. That's sort of the setup of the map is meant to be disruptive as well. And in the red are dominated by settler populations. These are settler states or states that also occupy indigenous lands within their borders. And the dark gray are decolonization or indigenization in process. This is a lot of the planet, right? So the settler states standing out are the US and Canada and Russia and Australia, New Zealand, some of South America. Decolonization is happening in a lot of places. So I just wanted to define that. And so when we talk about colonialism or settlement with Mars, a lot of people think it's kind of trivial. It's just kind of like a one-off conversation, comparison, or it's just a word that we have to use. And honestly, you know what? I kind of agree in the sense that think of a way to describe a group of astronauts living on Mars that doesn't use some sort of imperial terminology is really difficult. And why is that? I think that's a long answer. And I think it has to do with the core reason behind our terminology, which I'll get to. This is a quote from Megan Bartels from a really great article in 2018. So every one of the 12 humans to set a foot on the moon has been a white American man. Just 1 in 10 countries on Earth has sent an astronaut to the ISS. and only 3 countries in the entire Southern Hemisphere have been able to do so. The US sent its first Native American astronaut to space in 2002. Those statistics and the loaded terminology we use to talk about space are 2 sides of the same coin. I really, really like that. I really like that connection between the sort of idea of diversity and this issue, because I think a lot of times we don't want to mesh those 2 things, but they do have something to do with each other. I mentioned you send someone into space, they represent their country, they represent the political relations between countries, right? So what does it mean that most of the people who you send are men? What does it mean that most of the people you've sent are white men from the Northern Hemisphere and most likely Europe and the US, right? So this is another screenshot from Who Owns an Asteroid? So Mars isn't directly analogous to North America, right? But much of the language used to describe humans living there is borrowed from colonialism, and there's some examples. And Lucianne Walkowitz, who's amazing, wrote, even if words like colonization have a different context off-world, on somewhere like Mars, it's still not okay to use those narratives because it erases the history of colonization here on our own planet. I really like that take because it mentions narratives. And the narrative is one of conquest. It is of destruction, of environmental disaster, of displacement, of genocide. Those aren't really light things to refer to. And it also erases that history, it trivializes it. And that's a really great point. Here's a picture of MU69, also known as Arrokoth. And I included this, when was this? This was a couple of years ago that I had this in some slides. And the reason I used this was because it was nicknamed Ultima Thule back when it was imaged by New Horizons. And there was a lot of controversy about this name because it's a term that's used in Nazi mythology to refer to the homeland of the Aryan race and sort of bastardized from Nordic mythology. And there was a lot of pushback in many, many different directions about this name. And then finally, NASA decided to name it Arrokoth, which comes from an indigenous language from the area of NASA Goddard Space Flight Center, which had built, which was basically in charge of the New Horizons spacecraft. So it sort of went in a completely different direction. And I thought this was very interesting. It's something that was a bit unprecedented, that sort of complete change in naming convention. And I thought was very hopeful, but it was also sort of representative of a lot of naming conventions when it comes to space that I won't get into because that's quite a lengthy conversation. So coming back, going from terminology and sort of trying to find the motivation behind the terminology. I think a lot of people get hung up about the terms, and I do too. But I kind of wonder what's underlying that. What is driving our need to use that terminology? Why don't we have other language? So Linda Billings wrote, I believe this was a book in 2007, this rhetoric referring to terminology, westward expansion, manifest destiny, conveys an ideology of spaceflight that could be described at its worst, a sort of space fundamentalism, an exclusive belief that rejects as unenlightened those who do not advocate the colonization, exploitation, and development of space. I think this is very strongly worded and deserves the context that it had in the book. But it is something that is especially strong in the US, but is not absent from the UK context. I think also if you've been a woman on Twitter and said anything about Elon Musk, you know exactly what Linda is talking about. So I want to talk about that, the development, that ideology. I want to get to the ideology, and I've had ideology at the top of the slides, but not mentioned it. So what does it mean to consider learning and expanding in the unknown as vital or a core part of humanity or an impulse? Is it really? And what does it mean to have human nature? Who's defining human nature? Who's defining knowledge? Who's defining knowing? And is that a natural thing, or is it an ideological choice? So I'm going to break that down. That's a lot to think about. To impose knowledge is to treat knowledge as fundamentally objective. And I want to challenge that. How do we perceive knowledge itself? Well, let's go down all the way to the source of how we think about science. The Enlightenment, which was a movement in 16th to the 18th century, was basically this explosion coincided with the renaissance of philosophies, theories, and policies in Europe regarding education, science, art, and politics primarily. And this also coincided with the expansion of European empires, of slavery. So when we talk about the philosophies and theories that came out of the Enlightenment coincident with slavery, for example, in science, this is sort of the beginning of race science, of the invention of race to justify colonization, to justify slavery, to categorize human beings as other. And the scientific method was solidified along this process. The idea of science is ultimately objective, right? And separate from and precluding culture, politics, religion, and even the idea of the self, that science is the ultimate truth, that we have a biology, our biology dictates our lives, nothing else matters, came out of the Enlightenment. And I want you to stick with me. The Enlightenment produced our own self-awareness as scientists, our idea as scientists, as in a dichotomy with society as scientists and non-scientists, comes straight from the Enlightenment, was really developed in Victorian Britain, again, coincident with colonialism. So when you have a geologist who goes to the Amazon and is categorizing the gold veins in the Amazon basin and is not describing human beings around him, that is the separation of science from people. And so now you're sort of seeing why scientific objectivity kind of has to do with colonialism. When you define something as self-enforcing objectivity, you can't even criticize it because it is the ultimate truth. Then you can get away with a lot of things, right? Science is not pre-discursive. There are many systems of truth. Our Western science is not the ultimate undeniable reality. And by pre-discursive, I mean existing before description. So for example, race is not pre-discursive. It is a social category. It's not inscribed in our biology. It's produced socially, right? It's produced by us describing it with words or writing it down or attaching things to that concept. So Western science, even though we made up this little lie during the Enlightenment that science is pre-discursive, it exists before us even. It's produced by people. We produce the scientific method, right? Our terms for the features in this image are categorizing different features from each other. That's all us. A different culture might think those two components as similar, right? Our separation of different processes that form these features, our relationships to those processes and how we understand them. This is a dry riverbed. I relate to this dry riverbed thinking of riverbeds behind my house, right? That's all negotiated through my experiences of my world, of my experiences in society, and my relationships to them. And that happens to us in a larger scale. And that is what Western science is. That is what peer review is. That's what our publishing is. It's our own little system of knowledge, but it is not the only system of knowledge. That got extremely deep. And so I want to come back to Terra Nullius, for example. So science, if we think of it as a system of knowledge produced within systems of power to serve certain purposes, lots of different purposes, some good, some not so good. Terra Nullius was just one tool that tied science to expansion, right, in the race to seize resources and human labor in the global South. So the idea that expansion is human nature, objectively, is an invention. So we see this in how fieldwork, we almost treat this as like a right? We have, especially as geologists, we have a right to go to this remote place that is empty. We won't affect people because it doesn't have many people living there. And that's directly tied to westward expansion, for example, in the US and Manifest Destiny, where a lot of geology fieldwork coincided with people migrating west and committing genocide out west, right? So how does this affect how we treat space science? Coming all the way back from that little philosophical journey. European science, this is a really seminal piece by Quijano, and I'm going to link that at the end. It's very dense, and I would read Wikipedia pages about it first before reading it. But he sort of set the tone with science and technology studies and studying colonialism and science and systems of knowledge and philosophy. He wrote about European science being the measurement and quantification, externalization, or objectification of what is knowable with respect to the knower, so as to control the relations among people and nature and among them. That's pretty much what I've just all said in the past few slides, but in a tidy and very dense form. Edward Said wrote about culture and imperialism, and I always like to quote this. So the processes of imperialism occur beyond the level of economic laws and political decisions and manifest at another very significant level, that of national culture, which we have tended to sanitize as the realm of unchanging intellectual monuments free from worldly affiliations. I'm going to unpack that. This idea that colonialism and imperialism are sort of these actions that people took and they're all in the past, but they're actually really embedded in our culture. We tend to not only have them embedded in our culture, but think of them as reality, thinking of them as objective, thinking of them as quantified and rational, as Kiana writes. So what is our sort of culture about space? And Alice Gorman wrote, from colonial perspective, we think of space in terms of empty wilderness, moral vacuums, to which civilized seafaring or spacefaring nations can bring their right moral order. So what happens when the US and Europe dominate space exploration, and we're bringing our moral orders with us and our political orders and treating it as empty wilderness? And she says it's a mirror of those same aspirations played out on Earth. And Linda Billings searingly writes, as always, American history is a straight line, a vector of inevitability and manifest destiny. And so that's what I want to point to. It's not just the objective in the science. It is the impulse that is human nature. It is the inevitable. It is that we can't steer our course differently. It's that we can't change. And that's what I really want to challenge with us today. It's not just about our responsibility as space scientists, but also this idea that we can't even change our culture. We can't even change the way we do things. That has to be challenged, and it is a mythology. It is totally invented. Yeah, so Peter Redfield wrote, he wrote about these imperial tropes, right? So all the terms that I mentioned, so space has this like prospect of renewed form of settlement and seemingly without human difference, but as we know, that's not true. So Daniel Lee wrote in an article a few years ago, I worry that Mars exploration and colonization will be less about saving all of humanity and more about staking claims. After all, we've seen this before, right? This was a bit of a bonus, just to make all this like philosophy a bit more concrete. This is a page on a NASA website. I'm not speaking as a NASA employee here, that relates a Mars or lunar environment to Jamestown in colonial America. And if you don't know about Jamestown, it was a really horrible place where colonists killed a lot of indigenous people. And it just talks about how the colonists, well, they had to make do and they had to preserve their food and they had to ration their water and you know, wait for supplies to come by boat. And it's in this neutral tone. And I feel like this is so representative of a lot of ways that we talk about even space as it goes, right? So if we think about, for example, TMT on Mauna Kea, and a lot of times we say, well, people will benefit from it and we'll share our science. And not to start a whole conversation here about TMT, but it is on occupied land, and Native Hawaiians consider Hawaii as an occupied country. And it's framed in this very neutral, objective, rational way. And this is the culture that we have within our field of not considering human costs, of not considering material cost or what labor goes into the spacecraft that we rely on for our data, and who builds that and under what ethical conditions and what precedents we're setting for the future. And so Peter Redfield writes, whatever happened to empire did not simply vanish. It's right here in front of us. And Alice Gorman wrote, perhaps insignificant, the Tranquility Base artifacts, which includes the US flag on the moon, sort of represents the motivations of the space race to imprint a colonial meeting on the moon? And has that really changed if we're putting endless telescopes on secret land in Hawaii and other places, or in French Guiana, or other places on the planet? And I really like to quote this. This is from a climate workshop at NASA. And I don't know how this came up at a climate workshop at NASA, but it was about the mission LCROSS, which crashed into the moon in 2009 deliberately to look for subsurface ice. And in this report, it was called Native Peoples, Native Homelands. It was written, the moon has rights and does not belong to the US, who determines the right for countries to carry out activities on the moon. And I think this is really, really important. So a lot of people actually were quite upset about the LCROSS mission, just like people were upset about the launch of Curiosity rover, about the impact that it could have on other bodies. So this idea that the moon doesn't belong to anybody, and in fact is a deity in other cultures, is sacred in other cultures. And it's sort of considered, again, in this rational, objective way of course we can do this. Of course we can talk about Jamestown in this way. Of course we can put a telescope in this place. It's the science is there. The science precludes us, and we are just serving the science. But as we know, that doesn't really make sense. The science does not come before us. We make the science. So our concepts of other, of exploring, of unknown, and our own material history of where we come from, of the politics that come before us, of the geography and the relationships that come before us, inform the ways we frame and carry out space exploration, right? So all of this informs how we're going forward, and the language that we use to talk about it, and how we treat each other in the fields. And I want to come back to the amazing two talks that were prior to mine, of this does influence diversity in the field. This does influence harassment and discrimination in our field. So thinking of that in steps forward, here's another Peter Redfield quote that I won't read completely, but I really like the line that meaning is still measured from below, that we have to remember that we are setting this precedent. We are, no matter how much we can imagine a space that is equitable and free, we have to actually make it. We have to make space equitable. We have to make space inclusive and for everybody. Decolonization is not a metaphor, as Yves wrote in 2012. As non-Indigenous people, we have to work on understanding how our work is connected to displacement and extraction, and just the people around us. What is our responsibility to the people around us? What is our responsibility to minorities who are in our own institutions? What is our responsibility to the locals when we do our field work? What is the effect that field work has? Are they on our papers? That kind of thing. And again, how does this connect to diversity in work culture for minorities? So a colleague, Zara Khan, penned a white paper for the NASA Decadal Survey last year that looked at connections between the space industry and the military industrial complex, and how that affects the mental health and job retention and work satisfaction of minorities in space science and engineering. So there are a lot of ethical implications of our work, and they do impact us. And I'll personally say it extremely has impacted me. I've considered quitting this field many a time because of this. Sorry. We can't just act and work as and with space scientists. We have to think beyond ourselves. And I'll just wind it down really there. This is a map of scientific fieldwork, just showing that geologists, for example, work all over the world doing this field work. Do we consider the ethics that we need to be considering? Are we centering permission and disclosure and worth in our work? Is our work worth flying to do in another country where those people can't come to the conferences in our country because of visa restrictions? And I inserted this slide last second because I saw the IPCC report this morning that was really disturbing. And I just want to comment that climate change is a colonial issue. That 92% of emissions come from the global north. That the AGU fall meeting, for example, in 2019 emitted as much CO2 as the annual emissions of small countries in the Caribbean and Pacific Islands. The average Australian astronomer has 40% more carbon emissions than the average Australian. And that's not just flying, it's supercomputers and observatories to carry out astronomical research. And carbon offsets tend to not work, or they often displace native ecologies, which sort of undermines their worth. So this figure is just for a single attendee. If you look at flights, just a two-way flight for a conference between these different locations, and what equivalent carbon dioxide produced per capita of what countries that represents, which is quite stark. So I just kind of wanted to leave on that, just as we remember and think about climate this week, that climate has to do with colonialism. It is an effect that we do have on the world as astronomers, as space scientists. And we need more places to have these conversations. So thank you, Anya, for having this wonderful day set up. Here are just some organizations with more information. I plugged Space Science in Context, which is planning our next conference, hopefully. Lots of great people doing this work, holding forums, educating people, working with governments, advising for companies, doing amazing things. And with that, I'd like to thank you. Here's a QR code so you can scan it with your phone, and it'll take you to a PDF with all the papers that I cited and further reading as well. And that's it. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Divya. That was incredible. I feel like every slide, every new point you made, my mind was blown. I don't know, Helen, do you feel the same?
Yeah, absolutely. That was so thought-provoking. We could have had a whole session just on this. But I'll pass back to you, Anya, but thank you again, Divya, so much. So interesting.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks to all our speakers from today and our attendees. It's just been wonderful. I mean, we've all got a lot to think about. I'm not saying by any means, gosh, that we've fixed things or that we've done enough by having a one-off workshop. Gosh, isn't it half the stereotype? We've had an anti-racism workshop. Well done. I'm not saying that by any means, but as Addie said, like, if all of us do one thing today, you know, if we've learned to think differently about how we interact and how we treat our students, thanks to Jerita, if we've learned how to break that cycle of the racist structures, thanks to Addie, and gosh, Divya, if we learn to think about these colonial contexts, I mean, I've had my mind blown in so many ways. That image you kept going back to, and think the different questions you've posed there is so much more we can think on. And hopefully if every one of us today, even if just one of those things, we think differently, we start the conversations, who knows what change that'll bring. And hopefully if we bring those back to our institutions, you know, one small difference, but you know, like I say, I'm not saying this is the end of what the RAS is doing in this area. But yeah, so thank you, Addie, Divya, Jerita, for such an amazing afternoon. And also I do want to acknowledge and thank the RAS for funding today. I wouldn't have ran today if we wouldn't have ran today if we couldn't pay our speakers. It's really unethical to do that. And so for the RAS to say, yes, we'll fund this is amazing. And hopefully attendees, you'll all agree that it was very much worthwhile. Just a reminder to keep an eye out for there'll be a vacancy on our diversity committee CDAG in the next sort of few weeks to months. So if you really want to drive this agenda forward in the RAS, please do keep an eye on that if you want to join and help out on that front. Like I said, this event has been recorded. We will cut out the discussion side and any other parts that our speakers don't want recorded. But please do not send those round to your colleagues. They are very much just for people who've registered today. And also please do look out, there'll be a really short feedback form in that attached to that video as well. Just, you know, it's always good to know how you felt about today. But thank you so much to all our speakers and to Helen and Emma as well for helping host. What a wonderful afternoon. And please, everyone who's come today, give yourself some time. There's been a lot to take on, but hopefully we'll all come away with lots to think about. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Bye.